Thank you. I should just mention first that English is not my first language. And I've noticed when I speak English, because I need to concentrate more, I get a really grumpy look on my face, which is not good when you're a happiness researcher. I also get into trouble from time to time because of the language differences. So a couple of years ago, I did an interview in London, which was a sort of live show. I think they have 4 million viewers, so almost more viewers than I have countrymen. And you have those sort of 7 minutes to present your new book, and I think it's going well. But then the host, he says, so earlier you've written about hygge, now you've written about lykke, what you're going to write about next. And I thought his Danish was really good. And in the UK, they've seen a lot of the Danish TV dramas. And there's one Danish TV drama, which they pronounce Borgen, which is sort of a political drama. So here we are live, and he says hygge, and he says lykke, and I say, hey, well done on pronouncing Danish. You must have been watching a lot of Danish porn, which is how we pronounce it. But he heard you must have been watching a lot of Danish porn. So he started to laugh. Everybody else was laughing. I had no idea why they were laughing. But I just wanted to say, if there's something that is unclear, it might be because of the language differences. And also, we have time for questions in the end if there's something that are uncertain. So wonderful to be back in Vancouver. I actually have a couple of good friends in Vancouver, John and Millie Halliwell, who is actually one of the reasons why I got into happiness research in the first place. So I'll talk about a little bit about my new book, but I think I should also start talking about why I started the Happiness Research Institute back in 2013. So at the time, I was working for another think tank in Copenhagen, focusing on sustainability, but noticed how much was happening globally with happiness research. And different governments, they were starting to measure happiness and well-being as the way they measure progress. You had the UN publish the World Happiness Report, and Denmark was in first place in that report. And I thought, wow, there's a lot happening with happiness research. And Denmark is often doing quite well in these happiness rankings. There should be somebody in Denmark pooling all this knowledge and understanding why is it that we do quite well. And then I thought, maybe I should do that. By the way, am I talking loud enough for you in the back? Good. But this was 2012, and I also thought it would be a little bit risky to start something as a happiness research institute, just in the wake of the financial crisis. But then on the personal front, what happened was I had a really good mentor at the company I was working for, who I looked up to, and I thought, I want to be that guy in 15 years. He was a good boss, good colleague, and he seemed like a good husband and a good father for his kids. And unfortunately, he got very ill and eventually died when he was 49. And many years ago, my own mother had also died when she was 49. So I just started to reflect, what if I only live to see 49? What am I going to spend the next 15 years doing? And I thought I can continue with this job, which is fine, but I'm not super passionate about it, or I can start this crazy idea of a happiness research institute. And 2 months after that thought first occurred, I quit and started out with what I thought was a good idea and a bad laptop. And I think that's going to be the best decision that I'm going to make in my career. I should also say, I know it sounds like a magical place, the Happiness Research Institute, and I know people imagine we have a room full of puppies and a room full of ice cream. Unfortunately, that's not the case. We sit in front of our computers most of the time. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to look at happiness, well-being, and quality of life from a scientific perspective. And then a couple of years ago, what happened was I turned 40. And that means, statistically speaking, because men in Denmark live till we are 80, I had lived half my life. And I just started to look back and thought, what were actually my happiest moments? Which are my happiest memories? And how can I use that knowledge going forward and become better at creating happy moments and happy memories from my future self. And we just need to make a couple of distinctions here, because we have different sorts of long-term memory. So we have something called semantic memory, which is that everybody here knows that Paris is the capital of France. I'm sure none of us can remember when we actually acquired that knowledge. A different memory is remembering, if we have been to France or Paris, our trip to Paris. Now that's a very different sort of memory. It's much more vivid, it's richer, it has perhaps a taste, a sound, an experience, and something we can revisit. So it's the time traveling aspect that is the difference between those two, and it's the second part, the episodic memory that I've been interested in. And I think one of the biggest aha moments in writing and researching the book was coming to an understanding that we can actually influence what we remember. So earlier I thought of memory as something random, something I did not have control over, but now I can actually see I can influence, I can control, I can to some extent impact what I and my friends and my family remember in the future. And I think that's a quite empowering role to have, sort of a memory architect, to shape the future memories of people. And one of the things we did at the Happiness Research Institute for this book was we collected, which I think is the biggest global collection of happy memories from around the world. So more than 75 different countries we collected happy memories in. And first of all, a lot of fun to read through people's happy memories. And second of all, I also realized that I could relate to every one of those memories. And once again, I see how similar we are as people when it comes to happiness, that we might be Canadian and Danish, but we're first and foremost people, and we can see the same things drive happiness in different countries. So I think that the person who participated in the study with the most different background to mine was a man from Iraq, and his happy memory was from when he was 8, and he was able to buy a piece of toy with his own money for the first time. And I get it. I get why that's a happy memory for him. Also, one of my favorite memories in the study was from a British woman in her 30s. And she and her family decides one morning to go to the beach and have breakfast. And they go out there, and it's cold, and it's windy, and they can't get the fire going, so they end up eating this half-cooked porridge covered in layers of sand. Yet she still describes this as one of her fondest memories, unrivaled family time. They're sitting, eating this horrendous food, but being covered in a big blanket. And I think it's an example of how something that is a struggle in the moment can eventually become a quite happy memory. So, what we see is when we look back on our lives, there is a huge share of our memories from the period between we're 15 and 30. So if we ask people who are 100 years old, either to tell us their life story, or tell us memories that come to mind when we say different words like floor or lights or furniture, and then plot those memories on a timeline, we see this shape up here that there's a huge bump around our formative years, so between 15 and 30. And that is known as the reminiscence bump. The reason for that bump, and the reason why we have so many memories from that period in time, is that it is our formative years, but also because we have a lot of first experiences in those years. So first kiss, in my case, she was called Christy, and her dad was a rugby player. And it's a first job, first apartment, first car. And we can see that novelty, first experiences, stick better to memory. And that's why we have so many memories from that period in life, whereas at my age, 41, there's just fewer first experiences. And it's also one of the reasons why life seems to speed up as we get older. The years just simply seems to go by quicker and quicker. So obviously one of the things we can do is we can try and have more first experiences. But I'd also just like to subject you to an experiment. So I will show you some words on the next slide, and you're not allowed to take notes, so you have to memorize them, and you will have, I think, about 15 seconds to memorize them, okay? You all ready? Yeah? And don't worry, you're not going to fail. It's fine, everybody's going to pass, but we will go now. Very good. So now if you have pen and paper, you can write down. Perhaps if you don't have pen and paper, you can use your phone and write down as many words as you are able to remember. I did this to my colleagues, and our data analyst got 2 and asked, am I fired now? He's still with us. I had one group in London, and there was one there who was able to give us all of the words. But so we're looking at a spectrum between 2 and all the words. And we still have people writing. There's definitely one person thinking there. Okay, so let's stop. So how many of you have written the word panda? So all the way up with your hands, please. So that looks like 50%. No, the couch are doing quite bad. But it must be the angle. But okay, 40, 50%. So what about the word, down again, what about the word snail? 30%. Okay, couch are doing good on snail. Well done, couch. So what about the word cheesecake? All right, so here we have 70%. So that's what I hoped for. So the von Restorff effect, you just get, here's the final list. But so the von Restorff effect is that we notice the extraordinary things, right? So the same principle goes here as with first experiences. We remember first experiences, we remember extraordinary days. Also, if you're able to slip in the von Restorff effect in a conversation, people also, believe you are smarter. So that's a trick. But what we could see when we collected all these happy memories was a lot of them were first experiences, almost a quarter of them were first experiences. So, if we're interested in making more happy memories, we gotta harness the power of first. So creating new experiences, creating novel experiences, and that doesn't only have to be going to exotic places. It can also be trying out food we have not tried before. So it's always embarrassing when you show a picture and you realize you're wearing the same outfit. I do have other coats, okay. But so this is from this summer. I went to a restaurant in Denmark that has a tasting menu with 16 different dishes, and one of the dishes was ants on a piece of turnip. Now it was the first time I had ants. It's also the last time I had ants, but it's still the only dish I actually remember. Of course, because it pushed my comfort zone a little bit. We can also see doing stuff that scares us stick better to memory. But I think the advice here is seek out new experiences also in a gastronomical sense. So in the book I talk about creating something I call the Apollo picnic. You do it on July 20th and you invite all your friends and your family members, and the concept is that everybody brings an ingredient or a dish they have not tried before. So I'm not going to recommend ants, but it could be habanero chili or Danish herring. Great, by the way. And And everybody brings an ingredient they haven't tried before. It's going to push their comfort zone a little bit. And you do it on July 20th because that is the anniversary for the Apollo mission. You call it the Apollo picnic. And that means every once in a while the media is going to talk about the Apollo mission, the moon landing, and that's going to trigger your memory of that event. And that is how our memory works. We see something, we hear something, we taste something, we smell something, and that triggers your memory of a certain event. I'm sure all of you are familiar with listening to a song we heard in high school or something like that, and then instantly we are transported back in time. And taste is also a really powerful trigger in taking us on that time travel. So the woman here is a Spanish woman who was born in the earliest 20th century. She's called Modesta, which is Spanish for modest. But as her granddaughter said, she really wasn't. And she really wanted to go to university. But this was Spain 1920s, and her dad wouldn't allow it because he said, if you go to university, you will never be married. And he also believed that if she went to university, she would die because Modesta's sister had gone to university and had died. Yet she persisted, and she did go to university, but she was chaperoned by her aunt, who would follow her everywhere, and she would even sit in the back of the class with knitting needles and watch Modesta and watch the boys, that nothing happened. But then, after class, Modesta and her aunt, they would go to this bakery called La Mallorquina, which is in the center of Madrid, on Plaza del Sol, and they would have these small Estrella cakes after school. And Modesta did survive university, 3 degrees, by the way, did get married, survived the civil Spanish War, and lived till she was 97. But in her later years, she would ask her granddaughter to get her those Estrella cakes from that bakery. And probably because those cakes reminded her of something. That taste was the taste of her youth, it was the taste of freedom, it was the taste of happiness. And I think all of us also are familiar with something we had when we were a kid or young that reminds us of, a sense of freedom or being loved. We can see in our study a lot of people, when they thought of happy memories, thought of, their mother cooking poblano peppers in the kitchen or eating Italian ice cream with their families. These are the cakes, by the way. Of course, this is a classic element in memory research. I'm sure how many of you are familiar with Madeleine moments or Proustian moments? So Marcel Proust wrote about this phenomenon in his novel In Search for Lost Time, where the main protagonist, Marcel, he has a piece of this petite Madeleine together with some tea, and then slowly memories from his youth starts to come back. But I think we're all familiar with that experience. So we can also use other senses to transport us back in time and to install into happy memories. And that is something that Andy Warhol understood. So what he would do was he would wear the same perfume for 3 months and then never wear that perfume again and switch to another one. And that meant over time he had created a museum of scent or museum of memories. So he could say, now I want to go back to the spring of 1982 and then take a whiff of that perfume he wore at that time and then be transported back in time. I think it's also a little bit expensive way of doing it. So you can do it with songs, you can do it with food, you can do it with different sensory impression. But that is how our memory work. When we think of something, our brain collects different pieces of that experience from different parts of the brain. So a memory is not stored in one place in the brain, but when you think of something, your hippocampus, which you have one on each side of the brain, will gather the pieces from scent and sight and sound and how you felt about the whole stuff. So you will re-experience it actually in real time. So the takeaway here is make it multi-sensual, because the more different senses you have installed in a memory, the more or the bigger the likelihood is that you will trigger one of those senses in the future. So one of the things I did when I was writing the book was I always spent my summers on this island in Denmark. And there was this particular beautiful afternoon where I had been out spearfishing and caught a couple of fish. And it was a cold ocean because it's Denmark. And I climbed up on a warm rock and just felt there feeling quite happy. And the rock was warm, my breath was sort of slow, and I was just really sort of at peace with everything and felt really happy and thought, what can I do to hold on to this moment? And I think I was doing two things. I was paying attention to the moment, which we can see is the very foundation of memory and something we can actively use. And recently I spoke to a Polish woman who read the book and was reminded of a time when she was 8, and she's having dinner with her mom and her sister, and they're having a good time, they're laughing, they're feeling happy. And then her mother says to her, I hope you remember this moment. And here we are 30 years later, and she still remembers that moment because her mother made her pay attention to it. And I think that shows how powerful attention is and how powerful a tool it is. Of course, it can also be overused, because if every time Laura sits down with her family and says, I hope you remember this moment, they're going to tell you to shut up, right? But used every once in a while, we can actually, I think, become better at holding on to it. So I think that was the first thing I was doing in this moment. I was paying attention to it. I wanted to remember it. And the second thing I was doing was, I thought, how can I build in a scent to this memory? And it's good to find a scent that is uniquely associated with what we want to remember. So if I smelled coffee, that's not going to mean anything to me, because I have so many memories with coffee that this was not a unique trigger. But there was a pile of dried seaweed next to me, so I took a good whiff of that, and now that scent is going to remind me of that moment. So far, eating ants, smelling dried seaweed, those are the fast tracks to happy memories. But yeah, visit new places, try out new activities, organizing the Apollo picnic, all ideas to make sure we have more happy memories. You can also build in triggers using international days for different kinds of activities and organizing activities that fit with those international days. Then once in a while it's going to be announced that now is the International Day of Mountains, and if you have organized a hiking trip to the local mountain, that will trigger a memory of that day. We could also see in the happy memory study that obviously a lot of the memories people have and remember are emotional experiences. So we remember stuff that scares us. We remember the times we were sad. We also remember the times we were really happy. And we remember the ups, or the tops and the downs. So this is an overview of happy and unhappy days. This is something called the hedonometer, which is a tool that looks at the language people use on Twitter. So they've done two things. So every day they take a sample of 50 million tweets and then analyze which language is being used on those days. And linguistics have taken 10,000 words in English and then given them a happiness score. So laughing has a high number, depression has a low number. I think it's a little bit controversial because, for example, sandwich is a happier word than gravy, which I think is a scientific controversial standpoint. But some of the things do check out. Friday is a happier word than Monday. And then they combine that language score with the 50 million tweet sample. And then every day gets a happiness score. And you can see Christmas days, very happy days, Mother's Day, happier than Father's Day. And of course the unhappy days are national tragic events, as we are aware of. But we also remember those unhappy days. I'm sure all of you here remember where you were on 9/11. And we also know there's going to be global tragical events in the future, and those days are going to be remembered. Those are what we call flashbulb memories, where we have quite a vivid memory of what happened on that day. So what is interesting is that the closer we are to an event, the more vivid we remember it, and the more recent we think that event was. So back in 1981, we had two major sort of assassination attempts, one on Reagan and one a couple of months later on the Pope. Now, if you ask Americans which event was more recent in a few years afterwards, Americans will say the assassination attempt on Reagan was most recent. Catholics will say the attempt on the Pope. So the closer you are emotionally to an event, the more recent you think it was. It's also why you will remember your wedding as much more recent than your friend's wedding. And that is because of the flashbulb memory. We have more vivid memories of something that is very emotional to us. It also means that we know that there is going to happen some things in the future that our family and kids are going to remember quite vividly. There's going to be new variations of global tragical events, and we know our kids are going to remember those days. So I think the key there is to make sure they also look back on that day 20 years from now and remember something else than that tragic events. So I think it's on those days we make sure that we make our kids know their favorite meal. We make sure they know they are loved, because when they look back 20 years from now, they're also going to remember that statement and that sentiment. So using the emotional highlighter pen in that sense. It's also important to understand that we have two different selves. So how many of you are familiar with Daniel Kahneman? So Daniel Kahneman, he is a psychologist, but won the Nobel Prize in economics, in part because he documented that we have two different selves. So we have the experiencing self, which we are right now, who lives over and over for about 3 or 5 seconds at a time and doesn't really keep track of anything. The remembering self is the one that keeps track of everything. He's the one that makes sure that we can connect with the person we were 20 years ago. Now, these two people have different perceptions of what happens. So we can document that in an experiment where we first take your left hand and put it in relatively cold water, so 14 degrees, which is quite uncomfortable, for 60 seconds. And then we take your right hand and we put it also in 14 degrees for 60 seconds, but add 30 seconds with 15 degrees water, which is still uncomfortable, but not as uncomfortable as the 14 degrees. Now, if we then ask participants, which trial, number 1 or number 2, would you like to repeat? It would make sense to repeat this one because we get as much discomfort with this one plus additional 30 seconds of discomfort, right? But majority of participants in the study choose the second trial. And that's because when it comes to the remembering self, our memory is shaped by a lot by how things ended. So it's shaped by the peak of an event and how it ended. So that means that sometimes our remembering self will drag our experiencing self through things that are more unpleasant than the experiencing self enjoys. And remember things that are uncomfortable. It's also sometimes why we fight over household chores. So when we ask men and women, how big a share of the household work do you do at home? How big a share of the groceries, how big a share of the shopping, and how big a share of the cleaning and so on. When we add how big a percentage the couple say they do, it always adds up to more than 100%, right? And part of the reason for that is that we remember quite vividly when we did something, right? When I do the grocery shopping, I go to the supermarket, and they didn't have the thing we really needed, so I need to go to another supermarket. I get the thing, and then I'm in line, and I picked the wrong line, and there's a guy who didn't weigh his apples. Dude, you gotta weigh your apples. And we're standing there, and I pack all the stuff in one bag, and it's hard, and it's difficult. And then I go home and put the things in the fridge. If you do the shopping, I open the fridge and say, oh, great, we got milk. So it's a very different experience, and when we struggle with something, we are more likely to remember it. It's also why the family we talked about in the beginning, that struggle on the beach with the half-cooked porridge, it's also why that's going to be remembered in the future. So I think the takeaway here is if we build in a little bit of struggle in our adventures, that is also going to be a bigger likelihood that we remember that struggle in the future. So hiking up the mountain is more memorable than just taking the cable cart up the mountain. So one thing I've done in this regard is build in a little bit of struggle. I have been looking for a coin for a few years it's an old Roman coin with the goddess Felicitas on it, so the Roman goddess for happiness. And at one point I found it online, but thought, I'm not going to remember this experience if I just buy it online. And I was going to Rome a couple of weeks afterwards, so I thought, I'll find it down there. And I went to 3 different coin shops, and in the third one, we were looking through hundreds of coins with a looking glass, which I think is super cool that we were using a looking glass, and had to look at the back of the coins because the emperor is on the front of the coin and the coins are categorized by the front. But eventually we found this coin, which was a great, fun, memorable experience for me. So building in some sort of struggle in your adventures. But yeah, doing something scary, something that pushes us out of our comfort zone, trying to add good stuff to what might be global tragical events, end on a high note, and consider taking the long route. Now, I also just want to make sure we have time for questions. I'm just going to skip a little bit ahead. So some have recently called me the arch enemy of Marie Kondo. And that is because when it comes to memory, I think it's important that we have stuff. But it's important that we build in stories to the stuff we have. So finding manifestations of the happy memories we want to remember and building them into the stuff we surround ourselves with. So one thing I've done is, a few years ago, I saved up money to buy a chair I really wanted. But waited until I had published my first book to get that chair, because now that chair is a manifestation of that accomplishment it was to publish my first book. And also, for example, what the mother might do, the mother who brought her kids to the beach and have that horrible meal on the beach but was a fun experience. What she might do is she might go to that beach and then find a little stone, a nice stone, and then if she has a daughter, she could turn that into a necklace. And now that necklace will be a memento, a memory for her daughter to remember that time when her crazy family went to the beach and had breakfast. So using stuff to trigger the memories we want to remember in the future. That sparks joy. We can also, if we have kids, make them create a treasure map of happiness, or happy memory treasure map. And the concept is there that you rename places based on which happy memories took place at that place. So I've done that on Bornholm, the island I go to every summer. And of course these places have official names, but now they've been given different names based on which activities have taken place there. So there's the Wild Cherry Forest, there's Spearfishing Bay, and there's Skinny Dip Cove, which was a lovely afternoon. And it's just a way to build in my episodic memory to the spatial memory. So now when we go to those places, when we call those places by those names, that's also going to trigger happy memories of those places. And when we are at places, we're better at remembering what happened at those places. It's why the police will bring a witness to the scene of the crime, because we remember details we thought we had forgotten. So also for the research of the book, I visited my childhood home, and they actually had the original kitchen we used to have. I also took or asked my dad whether he could organize a tour around the town he spent his youth in, and sort of take a literal walk down memory lane. And that was a really fun afternoon for us. It's something that I think bonded us together. And being at those places where the stories he had told me a lot of times, but being at those places really brought those stories to life. So that's also definitely worth doing together with your parents. I wanted to end with this, because when we talk about memory, whether we say, okay, what is your most treasured memory, or can you tell me your life story in 4 minutes, or what's the most embarrassing thing that ever happened to you, Danish porn on live TV, those are actually some of the questions that have been built into a survey that is designed to make people fall in love. So sharing our past with others is actually also what can tie us together with other people. So my hope is, fall in love with each other if that's your desire, but I really hope you'll also fall in love with memory, because I can see our memory is really powerful. It does impact how we feel. We can see people who are able to retrieve happy memories are on average happier. It also impacts our sense of purpose and meaning in life, our sense of connection with other people, and it impacts how we act. So we can see that the memories we have actually impact how we act now, and also what we predict about the future. So I hope you remember this moment. Ends are optional. And I think we have 20 questions or so, or 20 minutes for questions or so, right?
Whatever you want to do.
Whatever I want. Very good. If there are any. Yes.
So from your research, is there a way to turn negative memories from your past into happier memories when you think of them in the present moment?
So I'm not sure that's the aim, actually. We all have unhappy memories. And I think as a happiness researcher, it's important for me to say also that we should embrace that. And with every life, there is unhappiness and heartbreak and struggle, and that's part of the human experience. So I'm not trying to say let's suppress bad memories, but I am trying to say let's make sure we can balance those with happy memories. So let's make sure we create happy moments and become better at holding on to them. But I think, my unhappy memories is also what has made me who I am, and I embrace that. So I think that's my aim, more than trying to reframe them, actually. Yeah. Yes.
It was really interesting to hear your connection of happiness to memory, but I was wondering also if your institute has done any research into what brings happiness to people in terms of their purpose in their life.
Yeah, so it's actually one of the main ingredients we see in happiness. So we work with happiness as a broad term, and to me, happiness is a dish with many ingredients. A sense of purpose is one of them, and it's actually it was the main ingredient for Aristotle, who was perhaps the first happiness researcher. So he wrote extensively about happiness and the good life, and to him, the good life was the meaningful life. So often we will see questions around whether people have a sense of purpose or meaning in life as part of happiness surveys. We can also see if people have that sense of purpose, they often also report higher levels of life satisfaction. So it also impacts other dimensions of well-being. But yeah, I think the key to measuring happiness is understanding that it's a wide, complex term that we need to break down and look at different components at. And it's also what we do when we look at other complex phenomena. If we talk about the Canadian economy, we also break that down into growth and GDP and inflation and unemployment, and that gives us a language to talk about how's the Canadian economy doing. So we do it the same with well-being and happiness. So we look at purpose, we look at overall life satisfaction, we look at what kind of emotions do people experience on a daily basis, both positive and negative ones. And then ideally what we do is we follow people over time to see how different life events impact happiness levels on these different dimensions. And we do that because we want to understand what is the cause and what is the effect in some of these elements. Because if we just took a snapshot in time, we could see that people who are married are on average more satisfied with life. But does that necessarily mean that we become happy from marriage? Or is it the other way around, that people who are happy have an easier time attracting a partner? And we can see that when we follow people over time. And actually both things are true. But we can also see, how global events impact happiness levels when we look at how happy people feel right now. We can also see people are happy on Fridays than they are on Mondays. But for example, in 2016, we could see the unhappiest day in the UK was November 9th, because we woke up in Europe and Donald Trump was elected president. And we can actually see that in the data. So a lot of different elements following people over time.
Any last questions?
There's one front.
Anyone in the back? In the front?
I just wondered if you can comment why, did you come up with conclusions as to why Danish people are a lot happier than the rest of the world? And should we move there?
So my first, actually 2 books was about that. But the brief answer is you shouldn't beat yourself too much up, because Canada is always in the top 10. And together with the other Nordic countries, so Denmark, Finland, Sweden, Norway, Iceland, always in the top 10. So I think, okay, there are many reasons for that. 2 books. But the short answer is, I think the Nordic model it's to some extent good at removing the price tag there is on happiness. And what I mean by that is, okay, there's access to healthcare, there's access to university education, there's a government stipend of $700 per month if you go to university, there's relatively equal opportunities for men and women, there's good work-life balance, meaning that you can have an interesting career and still have, dinner with your family on a daily basis. I think what the Nordic model does well is that it removes a lot of the causes for unhappiness we see around the world. So we can call them the happiest countries in the world. We can also turn it around and say perhaps they're the least unhappy countries. But I mean, of course, there's also a lot of challenges in the Nordic countries, and I'm not sure we can always live up to the myth or utopia that people imagine the Nordic countries are. And actually, in my last book, I joke a little bit about the Nordic myth. And in the book, I write that everything is great, and people leave the office at noon, and free Lego is handed out in the streets. But there was also this moment a few years ago where a train arrived 5 minutes late, but all the passengers got a designer chair and a letter of apology from the Prime Minister. And then there was actually, I thought it was obviously a joke, but there was a journalist from the New York Times that wrote me, was that a joke or did it really happen? And I wrote her back, of course it was a joke. Our trains are never late. So I mean, a lot of things work well, but of course there's also challenges there, right? But we are competing in the top 10, so I won't give away more secrets.
Okay. Any last? You got me thinking when you mentioned Aristotle, but how do you think happiness or the perception of happiness has changed over the course of history? Like, were people in general happier 200 years ago or 2,000 years ago versus today, or how has it evolved?
So in terms of the perception of happiness, I don't think it has changed so much. So Aristotle thought that meaning and purpose was a main ingredient in happiness. He also talked extensively about how relationships, how friendships are important to happiness. So I think across generations that some things are quite consistent. You probably couldn't make it out, but also on the Roman coin with the goddess of Felicitas, she was holding two symbols. So she was holding the symbol for wealth and the symbol for health. So having enough to make sure we can get the stuff we need and having good health, that was the perception in the Roman ages of what the good life was. Perhaps we need more ingredients today, but I think a lot of people would still mention that as part of the necessities for the good life. The second part of the question, are we getting happier or less happy? I think, well, we can see, I mean, I don't have data from 2,000 years ago, but we can see when we look at the past 10 years that it depends where we look. So in Western Europe, we have increases in happiness levels. The US going down each year. For some of the Asian countries like China, we also see decreasing levels. So it depends very much where you look. But as a whole, globally, we are slowly moving forward. But I think the real challenge is that we continuously struggle with converting wealth into well-being. So I think there is right now a sentiment that we have gotten richer as societies without necessarily getting happier. And we especially see a lot of countries in Asia struggle with this. South Korea is I think a poster child for that sentiment. Tremendous growth over the past 2 generations, but tremendous amount of people, or pressure on people, on young people in particular, highest suicide rate in OECD. And they are looking for new sources of inspiration in terms of how do we design good policies and education system and so on that allows people to flourish. So also still a lot of challenges there.
Time for one more?
Thank you for being here. It seems there is a active effort to making memories, but a natural way of remembering the bad ones. Is this true, or is that just? Can you repeat that, please? There's the active effort of making memory is what we're speaking about, but it seems like there's also a natural way of remembering the day-to-day negative memories naturally without the effort. So is this true, or is this just the interpretation of the negative memories and thinking that that's what you remember over the positive memories?
So we can see when people look back at happy and unhappy memories, they remember an equal level of details from both. So I don't think we necessarily have a tendency to remember more bad events than good events, but we have a tendency to remember emotional experiences. And that might also be why we remember negative events when we are scared or when we are embarrassed, like I was on live TV, because our brain is wired to hold on to that, because it might be useful information in the future. Whereas if we've done stuff many times that is not emotional, there's not going to be a need for additional pieces of information about this situation. So emotional events, we remember, good or bad. Yeah.
Meik Wiking, everybody.
Thank you.
Wow.
Thank you. Thank you.
The book, The Art of Making Memories. Thanks for everyone coming out. We have books for sale at the front desk here if you like. Have a great evening. Thank you.